So I've been doing research on her for about 3 years. When I first started, of course, every research starts with a basic Google search, and I started looking for anything that was written about her already. And unfortunately, there really isn't much. And Dave Connery wrote a newsletter article for Railtown's volunteers, and that was one of the first things I really saw about her in detail. Research has gone a long way since then, but thank you, Dave. That was how we started corresponding. Thank you for inviting me here. I'm really excited to be here. So, Annie Kline Rikert and her railroad. Annie Kline lived between 1842 and 1906, and her life really had 3 major pillars to it. For one thing, she was a spy during the Civil War. Another thing, she was a successful miner in Southern California and up here a little bit as well, but mostly in the Mojave Desert. And she was the first female president of a railroad. As we'll see, that railroad never got completed, but she does have that to credit herself with. So before I get into a railroad, I kind of want to briefly go over her life a little bit because it's just such an interesting life, and it kind of explains what led up to the railroad being started. So her early life, from 1842 to 1880, we're going to go into Mississippi, Texas, and San Francisco. So starting in Vicksburg, Mississippi, she was born in Vicksburg in 1842, around 1842, and she was born to a family that owned a cotton plantation, and as such, this is in the slave years, they also owned slaves. They didn't own just a couple slaves, they owned about 30 at the peak of the plantation. So they very much were thriving off of the slave economy in the South. And she was the eldest daughter in the family, eldest child. And the second child was a daughter, and the third child was a daughter. So at that point, the father and the owner of the plantation decided, I'm going to raise the eldest daughter to inherit the farm. So he raised her in a different way than most women in this time were ever raised. She was raised to shoot a gun, ride a horse like a man, and how to handle slaves and farm. So she was immediately living a very different life than women in this time period. And she spied for the Confederacy. Like I said, she was from Vicksburg. Those of you familiar with the Civil War, the Siege of Vicksburg was one of the most important battles. And after it was won, the Union occupied Vicksburg. So what she did, she still lived in the occupied territory, so she spied and listened to conversations and smuggled goods out to Confederate troops outside of the occupied zone. And that was around 1863 to the end of the war that she was doing that. And after the war, she and one of her sisters moved to Texas. So that's where they headed after that, which brings us to Bell County, Texas, which is just a little bit north of Austin. It's an empty place. I really want to go out there sometime just to see what it's like, but the population is, I think, less than 1,000 people. It's a rinky-dink place. But it just doesn't look like a lot of the people in this area kept records or have a really well-organized historical society. But I do know 3 things. The first is that in 1873, she married a gentleman named William Townsend. And I know that William Townsend was a soldier in the Civil War. However, I'm not sure on what side of the war. Believe it or not, I have one person that kind of was in the family history, the family stories being told, says that he actually was on the north, which adds even more, for the Union, which adds even more complication to Annie's perspective on the world. In 1874, she gave birth to her only child, a woman named Maud Townsend. This was her only child and probably the most important thing in her life up till she died. She wanted Maud to have a good life, and a lot of what she did in her life was for her daughter. And Maud, although I don't really hit on it hard up in this, she's always with Annie throughout all of this. So as I go through this, remember, her daughter is with her. And then in 1876, Annie and her family moves to San Francisco. So 1876. I just have this here because I'm fascinated. It's a question I really want to answer is how did she get to San Francisco? In the late 1870s, there were really only 3 ways to go. The new Transcontinental Railroad was one of them, so going from north to south. She would have had to travel to Omaha, Nebraska, and then take the train west. Or she could have done the way of the Oregon Trail and gone overland I don't think that that's as likely at this point, mostly because the steamship was the other common way, which she would have taken from the coast of Texas to Panama, either cross the Panama via train or by foot, and then taken another steamship up. But I just find that interesting to think about the ways people got around this country in the 1870s. And that brings us to San Francisco. And she was in San Francisco with her family from 1876 to 1880. We know that she operated a small home business. She made artificial flowers, fake flowers. And that's just fascinating to me because what an odd home business to have. It's also fascinating because even when she's trying to live a somewhat domestic life, she's still doing something other than just being a mother. She's always having something else going on to keep her busy. Her husband worked as a clerk in the city. In 1877, just a year after they moved there, they lost everything in what was called the San Francisco riot of 1877. It was one of the more violent riots at this time. It was a bunch of very displeased workers. After the railroad was completed, as a lot of you probably know, on the west side of the railroad, the Central Pacific used a lot of Chinese immigrants for their work. Well, all these Chinese immigrants were unemployed and were, at this time, very cheap labor. So a lot of white Americans were very upset with that. And a riot ended up happening because there were a lot of labor struggles in the Bay Area. And she lost everything because, as it turns out, she and her family lived in an apartment above a Chinese laundromat that was burned. So they lost everything. They were destitute. In 1878, her close family died. Her mother, in Mississippi, there was a yellow fever outbreak. Her mother, her youngest brother, and her closest sister, the second sister below her, all died. And she probably got that news in 1879 because news traveled much slower. And sure enough, in 1879, Annie actually suffered a nervous breakdown, and she went missing for about a week in San Francisco, her and her daughter. This is actually the first time I read about her in newspapers because it was kind of a news spectacle in Northern California. This woman and her daughter being missing, the news was liking to make it seem as though she might have killed herself and was distraught and all this stuff. That wasn't the case. She actually was found, she walked around the streets of San Francisco until a wealthy woman from Sacramento found her and took her in and got her back on her feet. She was living away from her husband. Her husband, they're still married according to the 1880 census, but they were living in separate homes. So that tells me that their relationship took a nosedive. It's unknown exactly why, if it was the destitution, if it was Annie's breakdown, who knows? That's probably lost to history. But that brings us to the second portion, which is mining. And she mined in 3 areas: Calico in the Mojave Desert, Baja, Mexico, and up here in the Sonora area. And this is going to take us from 1881 to 1897. So who's ever heard of Calico? Anyone? Calico Ghost Town? Most of you. Younger people don't know. My students, my peers don't know what that is. Well, it's a small tourist town now, but it was actually the last silver boom town in the West because, unfortunately, or not unfortunately, but historically, silver dropped in value in the late 1880s. And for those of you that don't know, if you're driving down the 15 toward Vegas, just past Barstow, you'll see a hill that has a bunch of white rocks that say Calico. It's right out there. So she went out there in 1880, between 1880 and 1881, after she heard that silver was discovered. I'm not sure if she heard this on her way back to Mississippi to see her family, or if she heard about it up in the Bay Area. But either way, she and her daughter, who is, by the way, around 6 years old, travel there. They have pretty much no money. She has absolutely no experience in prospecting whatsoever, and her husband isn't with her. So this is a whole new stage in her life. But within the first few months of Calico becoming a boomtown, she finds 2 of the most profitable claims there, and she became the most successful woman in the town. And between 1883 and 1886, she met and married a gentleman named Austin Rikert, and this is where she gets her full name, Annie Kline Rikert. Just to kind of note, she kept her last name involved in her full name. She was very proud of her family and her family name back in Mississippi. And in 1887, silver went down, lost its value, which is why Calico became a ghost town. And she left Calico for gold fields in Baja, Mexico. There was a small boom down there. So she left down there. Oh, this is her. This is the first photo I have of her, earliest photo I have of her. This is at Calico. And so that's her on the left. This gentleman here is presumably Austin Rickard. I'm not 100% sure. And based on other photos I have, I think that's her daughter. Because I think this was right about the time they were leaving. She would have been probably around 15 or 16 years old. So mining, she went to Baja between 1887 and 1893. She mined for gold. And the one little thing here is she bought a white horse down there and named it Snowflake. And the reason I say this is personally, I find this so entertaining that somebody that's so rough around the edges, a woman that's so rough around the edges and living in a man's world a lot of the time, decided to name her horse Snowflake. And the second reason I point this out is because Snowflake, she says in multiple newspaper articles later on, that Snowflake was her favorite horse and went with her everywhere when she was doing, exploring the mountains around here. In the 1890s, there was a resurgence up here, as a lot of you know, to start looking for gold again. So she bought a few abandoned and old mines up here. And apparently one of the mines had contents worth upwards of $1 million. That's according to her. Not 100% sure if that's true, but that's what she claimed. But there was no way in the first years of the 1890s to actually process the ore up here. You would have had to transport it to other bigger towns like Stockton to have that processed and find out. So that brings us to the idea of the Stockton and Tuolumne County Railroad, and this is the bulk of my presentation. So the origin of the railroad, Rikert, like I said, owned profitable mines in Sonora. The closest ore processing was around the areas like Stockton, the major cities of the time, but it was too expensive to transport the ore in wagons. So, in 1897, Rikert scouts out a possible route between Stockton and here, Stockton and Tuolumne. Now, this is interesting because the Sierra Railroad did the same exact thing. The difference is Sierra was not able to get the rights of way. That is different in the case of Annie, as we'll see in a little bit. And on December 24th, 1897, Rikert forms her railroad. I am fascinated to answer the question. I really want to answer it. Why did she want to do this railroad in the first place? Because this is almost a year after the Sierra Railroad itself formed and was heading to Jamestown. So I'm really wondering, Jamestown was not quite where her mines were. Did she just want a railroad that went right up to her mines to make it a real easy process? I'm not quite sure. I hope to have that answered someday. The organization of the railroad. She was the president, and the board of directors, it was 3 women and 1 man. So this is why it was called the Women's Railroad by locals and in the newspapers. And I have a modern version of what the map of the route would have looked like. It would have gone from Stockton all the way to Tuolumne, stopping in Farmington, Copperopolis, Jamestown, and Sonora. And the 3 goals, similar to the Sierra Railroad, was to be to transport ore, transport lumber, and transport people. And I'll come back to that map a little bit. Just a few photos. Her company office was room 1 at the Grand Hotel in San Francisco. This hotel was right next to the Palace Hotel, which still exists. Unfortunately, this hotel burned down in 1906 after the earthquake and was not rebuilt. This is presumably part of the office, according to her descendant. This is a photo of her and Snowflake right here in their little buggy that apparently she traveled from up here to San Francisco back and forth in. I have a photo of that at the back table as well. I actually have a few artifacts back there. You're welcome to look at during breaks and ask me questions. And this is her portrait, which I think a version of it is in actually in Dave's newsletter. And so just a brief timeline of the railroad. January and February of 1898, word spreads of the railroad. They get their initial investments. And company stocks are starting to be issued out. She hired the Erickson brothers to grade and build the road. Anybody hear the Erickson brothers before? Charles and Fred Erickson? A couple of hands up. The Erickson brothers, it's important to note that in 1897, the year before, built most of the Sierra Railroad's initial routes, so they had a relationship with the Sierra Railroad. I think that's really important to point out right here. She obtained the rights of way, which is something that the Sierra had trouble doing, and I have those rights of way documents at the back table you're welcome to look at. And the grading work began at the end of March. April, May, and June, the grading moved steadily. The route was surveyed all the way up to Copperopolis, so from Stockton to Copperopolis, they were all set to have this railroad built. In July, the railroad is mortgaged for $25,000, meaning either they're having some money troubles or they just need an extra little bit of money to keep the railroad going. And the rails, this is very important, are about to be laid between Stockton and Farmington. This would be the point where they actually have trains on a track. But the work stopped. On July 30th, 1898, the Erickson brothers and most workers walked off the job. Of course, those workers were employed by them. Charles Erickson claimed that Rikert was not paying his workers. Rikert immediately, the day after in the newspapers, was saying no, the Ericksons were in collusion with the Sierra Railroad to keep her railroad from being built. I think it's easy to point out her railroad would have been in direct competition with the Sierras. They had the same goals, and the only difference was she was going to Stockton, which means she has much better ways of getting to the shipping on the river heading to the Pacific. And on August 1st, 2 days later, the Erickson brothers and others involved in the business served attachment papers on her. The company's rails, tools, and construction materials were seized, the rails being the main part of it. And the Ericksons and others claimed over $9,000 in that time's currency that was unpaid. So going back to the map, this green line is how much she had done, how much grading she had done. Rails were ready to be set to have the train started here. The railroad work stopped right about where the hills start to get a bit bumpy toward Copperopolis. And it's really important to point out that she had about a third of this railroad graded. This was not just a paper business. It was being built. But unfortunately, litigation is what stopped the railroad. The railroad was sued by the Erickson brothers and other investors. I'm still finding court cases that I didn't know about by people that were claiming money. And she was caught in a web of litigation. The litigation outlived her. She died, and the railroad she was still being sued. And even with all of this litigation, she did everything in her power to keep this railroad alive. In August 12th, this is just after, about a week or so after the railroad stopped being constructed, the railroad issued $1 million in bonds. They had trouble getting people to buy those bonds, so they were just paper. I have some of those bonds at the back. Rickard promoted the railroad in major newspapers, especially the San Francisco Examiner. They gave her a lot of sympathy, and you'll see in a moment. I have a few scans. And the railroad's reputation was tarnished, so no matter what she did, anybody that had the money to invest would not invest in that company at this point. So here's two of the articles. She got huge spreads. She had illustrations. This whole paper, I mean, you look at these old papers, they're huge. They're huge newspapers, and she got a lot of exposure in them. All of them pointing out her life and why she's a perfect person to be running a railroad, and that the railroad's not down, it's going to be built. But newspaper articles couldn't finish it up. And that brings us to her later life. She ended up moving to Reading in 1899, and the reason I have a map, we all know, a lot of us know of Reading, but it's really important to see just how far north she moved. San Francisco, we have, east of Fresno, we have where she was trying to build a railroad. She moved far away from all of this, and it was because, as she claimed, she was seeking seclusion. The press was constantly hounding her. She became a spectacle yet again because she was the failed woman's railroader. And she operated a small home distillery, I guess. I'm assuming she drank some of her own product at this point in her life. And then the little bit I know of her, in 1904, her and Austin Rikert divorced. She kept the last name. She died as Annie Kline Rikert. In 1905, the railroad was officially forfeited, which means they stopped paying their business license fees, and the state of California officially said they are a forfeited company. And at the end of 1905, Charles Erickson wins the main court case. He was claiming $9,000 But here's the rub. She only paid $1,200 of it. She paid most of that $9,000, and over the course of a few years, she was able to prove I paid most of that money. That $1,200 or so at the that she still owed might have been paid pretty easily had the railroad kept moving. I don't know for sure, but it's interesting that she was only forced to pay a fraction of what was said was owed. And then in December of 1906, Annie Kline Rikert died in Sacramento. She went there. She, I guess, had cancer. I would assume lung cancer, considering the mining, but I'm not sure. And her daughter was there at her deathbed. And she's buried, she's interred at Cypress Lawn Memorial Park in San Mateo. So if you're ever out that way and want to see her, she's there. And that brings me to my little last point, which is about her legacy. I regularly ask, what was it that drove her to take up prospecting with no experience whatsoever? What was it that drove her to go out alone and traverse the country between here and Stockton to lay out her own route for a railroad? What was it that motivated her to create her own railroad and directly compete with the brand new Sierra Railroad? Considering that California was one of the politically progressive hotspots in the late 19th century, some have posited it to me that she did all this work as a new woman. A new woman is a term, if you're not familiar with it, a term historians use to describe women who started stepping out of the domestic sphere, that started living their own lives outside of motherhood, that started working for themselves or recreating. I disagree with this. I don't think she should be called a new woman. She never really truly entered the domestic sphere to begin with. She was raised as a farmer, and she was spying in her early 20s. She was not a traditional 19th century woman, so I disagree to call her a new woman. One historian suggested that Rikert may have been trying to raise the status of women, that she was politically motivated to do all of this work, as others did in a time where women had few opportunities compared to men. I also disagree with this, though, much to the chagrin of one of my professors at Cal State Fullerton. I have yet to come across a single document or a reference to her doing anything for political reasons. And so I've come to the conclusion that the driving force behind Annie Kline Rikert's work, her mining and her railroad, came from pure ambition and a determination to survive and succeed. Indeed, she and her railroad did raise the status of women. She revealed what women were capable of in industries that primarily centered around men. She did so much in a time where women could do so little. But she didn't do these things for women. And she didn't do these things to prove something to men. No, she did them for herself, and that is a rare thing to find in any person, man or woman, in the 19th century or any other period. That is why Annie Kline Rikert's life and her railroad is worthy of remembrance in local, state, and national histories. Thank you. I am happy to take questions if you have any questions, because yeah.
The rails that, when the railroad stopped, did you ever trace where they ended up going to?
So when they were seized, they were in the hands of the sheriff at Stockton. And I think I remember reading that the Southern Pacific bought them, actually. And they were they were apparently some of the best rails that you could have.
I was wondering if the Sierra ended up with them.
No, apparently the Southern Pacific did, but they had a pretty good relationship, both railroads. Yeah.
What ended up with Maud? What did she do?
So Maud ended up marrying. She ended up having a pretty domestic life, to be honest. She did put Maud in college. At what ended up becoming San Jose State. San Jose State University was initially a women's college, and Maud was actually the first year graduate there. She was one of the first graduates there. So she was well educated, and like I said, Annie did everything she could for her daughter to have a good life, so she made sure her daughter was educated. She married a man named Floyd, and then, like her mother, divorced him, and then married another person. And she had a daughter who married but didn't have kids, but adopted 2 kids, and one of them is somebody I'm in contact with. So although not a blood descendant, that's the tracing of it.
Your research, was it mainly online, or did you have to go to individual archives in different locations?
Right. Well, my research started online, and I regularly check online. There's a few newspaper archives that are really useful. We're really lucky to be in California for history research because we have the California Newspaper Archive that UCR has online, and they're constantly adding more newspaper reels from all the way back to the first days of California, to the 1840s. So that's where I did a lot of my initial research. But I did go to a few different archives. I spent a lot of time out at Calico, and the historian at Calico, as well as the Historical Society at San Bernardino County. And they had a lot of stuff about her mining there. I'm currently in contact with the retired curator of the Western Museum in LA, and he apparently has some resources that I hope to tap into about her mining exploits. For her railroad, I was more dependent on newspapers than I'd like to be. I would really like to actually spend a decent amount of time up in this county, in San Francisco, and doing a lot more in-depth research. I'd love to get my hands on some Sierra Railroad documents during this time to try and see if they even have a reference of this railroad trying to be built. Yeah, I definitely went to a few different archives. Yeah.
Yes, and Dorothy Neal Dean's book makes reference to publication of a drawing of a bridge that was going to cross the Stanislaus.
Yes, as you know, the dam here is man-made locally. So the Stanislaus River used to run free. And she was planning to have what would have been apparently the longest wood trestle in the western U.S. Right about here. Yeah, so that was planned, but unfortunately the work stopped here and the surveying itself stopped around here, so it never got past that.
Yeah, they mentioned that a drawing of that bridge was published in a newspaper, so...
I think I came across that once. I, for some reason, didn't decide to scan that. I apologize, I don't have that with me. But I'll need to do research a little bit more on that and go through some old newspapers.
Next year.
Next year, sure, next year. Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. Any other
So-
question?
Very interesting.
So the survey was completed up to Copperopolis,
Yes, that's correct.
and any idea of any record of that survey?
Well, that's all based on newspapers, but it's multiple newspaper articles that she embellished the truth in certain aspects, including about her spying for the South. I very much say a lot less than what she did about what spying she did because I have yet to see evidence of it. But as far as the railroad goes, she was regularly saying the same exact thing, which makes me think that she was telling the truth in how far the railroad's progress was. But again, I have yet to actually look at railroad records myself, or land records myself, which is something I would like to spend time up here doing at some point.
Are you writing this up or making a book out of it, or what?
So yeah, the plan is to write an academic paper that gets published in an academic journal before I move forward. But the reason why is when it's in an academic journal, it's kind of like in scientific article. It gives it that founding because it's peer reviewed and other historians have looked at it. Because I mean, her story is remarkable and it's incredible that nobody has really looked into her too much before, except for at the surface level. So I'm trying to handle this in the best way I can. So academic journal first. I'm planning to continue on to graduate school, and this will probably be my dissertation, and that might lead to a book down the line. Who knows? Yeah.
And then a movie.
And then I would love that. Oh, I would love that. That would be great. So if you know any producers, that'd be great. Yeah.
And, you mentioned that you have some artifacts back there. How did you get hold of those artifacts?
So like I said, I kind of traced the lineage down. And so the adopted son of Annie's granddaughter, it has what's left of her stuff, and he's been slowly giving me, because for some reason his family just doesn't take an interest. So he's been giving the items to me, and I'm happy to talk more about them during the breaks, since I can actually show you the documents right there. And I have more items, but these are the ones that I feel like are really relevant to the railroad.
Appeared like you had the purse back there.
Yes, I have her purse. That one I have just because that's just amazing. I have something she carried, and for those of you that want to look at the purse, she got it from her father, who visited her when she was in Calico, and she carried it until she died. I have a photo of her in old age, probably after the railroad failed. There she is holding it. So I love showing that to people.
The railroad was eventually built on her grading?
Yes, in fact, when I drove down, I made a point for my parents. My parents are here with me today, and we drove through Farmington, and the NSF was riding right down it. But yeah, the main road on Farmington, that was basically what the route was going to be. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I think, yeah, if you have any other questions,